It sounds like a bunch of kids who are on Adderall having a sleepover party.
Look.
Sam Bankman-Fried just had his first public interview post-FTX crash with the New York Times. In this interview, Sam is asked many difficult questions and makes an attempt to defend his foolish actions that led to the FTX crash. However, as you will see, he gets utterly humiliated by the interviewer and ends up looking like a fool. Make sure you watch the entire interview because you'll finally get all the answers you've been dying to hear, including why Sam suspiciously donated millions of dollars to the Democratic Party.
Can you just speak to the idea of this company that, at least from the public perspective, seemed like a regulated company or something that was very focused on compliance? You would go to Washington, you talk about compliance, you talk about trust. Crypto ultimately is actually about trust. It's about not having to trust others, frankly. It's supposed to be a trustless system. That's why you trust trust it so much, supposedly. But it seems like when you read the stories, it sounds like a bunch of kids who are on Adderall having a sleepover party.
Look, I screwed up. I was CEO. I was the CEO of FTX. And I'd say this again and again, that means I had a responsibility. That means that I was responsible ultimately for us doing the right things. And we didn't. We messed up big.
But there were people, though, who were telling you needed more compliance, no?
There were, but I think that compliance, we were spending an enormous amount of our energy on compliance. We were spending an enormous amount of our energy on regulation, on licensure. We were getting licensed in dozens of jurisdictions. I think, frankly, we were spending probably too much of our energy getting licensed in retrospect. There were some places where I think that the reporting and transparency obligations from that licensure actually did help. I think when you look at, FTX US derivatives, I think when you look at FTX Japan, which I think is fully solvent, which I think could make all customers whole tomorrow if it were, the sort of relevant teams were to allow it to, and confused why it hasn't. I think that a lot of what we ended up doing and focusing on was a distraction to some extent from one unbelievably important area that we completely failed on, and that was risk. That was risk management. That was, customer position risk, and frankly, conflict of interest risk. And there was no person who was chiefly in charge of positional risk of customers on FTX, and that feels pretty embarrassing in retrospect because that was you go back to 2019. Even 2018 asked me, why am I starting to build out FTX? What's the point of it? And what I would have said was, look, the existing crypto derivatives exchanges have large risk management failures, that every day there are millions of dollars that are being lost by customers because of risk management failures, that these contracts are paying out 75 cents on the dollar week after week after week because of risk management blowouts, and that needs to be overhauled. And that was what I was focused on for the beginning of FTX. I was not focused on that for the last year or two. I got less grounded from that, and I started focusing on the bigger picture, on future business avenues, on licensure, on a lot of things. And we lost track of a really important part of the business and of the product. And so there absolutely were management failures, huge management failures. I bear responsibility for that. There were oversight failures, transparency failures, reporting, so many things we should have had in place. I think that a lot of it was on the risk management side.
Let me ask you about that, which is, we had Larry Fink here today, and he had a stake in FTX. And Sequoia and Paradigm and some very big venture capital firms had given you money. And I'm curious if they ever asked you questions about this risk management. and whether they bear any responsibility for what clearly now appears, and you're saying, was at minimum a lack of oversight, if not something much worse.
I don't think they bear responsibility. I mean, like, when you look at, you put yourself in the eyes of an investor, of a venture capital firm. What you're thinking about primarily is upside, right? What you're thinking about primarily is investing in a private company and thinking, might this 3x, might this 5x, might this even 10x on the upside cases. And yeah, there's some chance that it will go down. There's some chance that maybe it will go down to zero. But that's counterbalanced by the upside propositions here. And so most of what they were focused on was, I think, like, what might FTX become? What's the pathway to get from here to there? What would it take? What are the missing pieces? Rather than, at the point where you're dwelling on all of the various precise downside scenarios and risks for a prospective venture investment, that means you're not investing. Like, if that's where your head's at, if you think the odds are that that's where things are going to end up, why would you do that investment?
Sam, let me ask you about this, though, because the other piece of it is using your money and influence, and I think there's a question about whose money you were using, but to donate, for example, to the Democratic Party, in large part, to influence regulation. And I think as people have looked through now some of the regulation you were pushing for.
The CFTC regulation there, ultimately there may have been an ability to self-certify contracts, but prior to that, we went through a congressional hearing, a public comment period, a public roundtable, a year of inquiries, and tens of thousands of hours, thousands of pages of submitted documents, and still had not gotten to the point of having a license to offer margin futures in the United States. And so it was an extraordinarily long and hard process that we were going through with the CFTC. It was by far the most intensive regulatory process that I'd ever seen.
Can you speak to the lobbying piece of it, though?
Yeah.
And the donations piece of it? Because I think that's become part of the story as to whether you effectively were influencing lawmakers to do your bidding, and given the state of your current company, questions about whether that should be the case.
So, lawmakers were not ruling on FTX. FTX didn't have an application before Congress for anything. My donations were mostly for pandemic prevention, and they were looking at primary elections where there were candidates who were outspoken in favor of doing things now to prevent the next pandemic. That was the primary thing that I was supporting with those contributions. And, it was on both sides of the aisle, primarily operating in both primaries, because I wasn't viewing it as a partisan exercise. I was not, most of this was not looking at donating to one party to beat the other one in the general elections here. It was, not only was it on both sides, but even within each side, it was between two candidates in the same party, and it was looking at pandemic policy.
Where did the money come from for those donations?
So, basically profits. It was substantially smaller than the amount of trading profits that Alameda had made over the prior few years.
Related to this, you had a meeting with Gary Gensler. You also met with folks at CFIUS. Do you think you needed to buy your way into those meetings?
I don't think I need to buy my way into them. I do think it was harder than I would have thought it would be to get to the point of being even able to have meetings with some regulators. And I spent hundreds of hours, probably thousands of hours in DC trying to get to the point where I could even have meetings with some of the relevant regulators. But that wasn't a money thing. And there's no donations to Gary Gensler's. He doesn't even have a campaign to donate to in the first place. that was like elbow grease. I mean, that was just asking again and again and again to have meetings with relevant regulators and submitting hundreds and thousands of pages of documents.
You also made big investments in a number of media companies, and I think that's raised a lot of questions about whether you were trying to buy influence. Can you speak to that?
I mean, I think media matters a lot, and I want to support good media ventures. That was the whole thesis there. And, I don't have like governance over any of these. I wasn't looking for governance over them. I was looking to support journalists doing great work because I think what they do is really important. And I think that there needs to be a critical eye on stories. I'm certainly seeing, being on getting the brunt of a lot of that right now. And, frankly, I think it's healthy for the world that there is real investigative journalism.
Click here to watch Cardano co-founder Charles Hoskinson explain his fears about how the government is using the FTX crash as an excuse to ban crypto.